come now and remember, how is it that we live? I wonder how many of us here this morning can remember how our grandparents lived. Did they have a wood stove? Did they have a car? Probably not. My grandparents were all born before 1880 and were married by 1900. And automobiles, and telephones, and electricity came in pretty much after 1900 in any large sense. There were trains. There was the Morse code. I think they could send some electric signals down a railroad track. But the way they lived was far different than we live now. In just 2 generations, there have been so many changes. I wonder if in your grandparents' house you had any of these things. I've put this back together because it didn't fit underneath. How many of you have a stereoscope in your grandparents' house? This is from their house. As is Uncle Wiggly book. My grandfather used to read Uncle Wiggly to me. I don't know what happened to Uncle Wiggly. The copyright ran out, or people hung on to the copyright and have never done anything with it. Anyhow, I loved Uncle Wiggly at my grandparents' house. I can guarantee you that this is not used in houses today where you have iPads and smartphones and other ways of seeing the world. But this, you can't beat this. This is in 3D. And not only that, it comes from, most of the pictures that I have are from 1890. And they have a lot to do with the Spanish-American War. So these aren't in homes anymore. In those 2 generations, we have made so many changes. The decades have been all different. The Roaring 20s, 2 world wars, the Depression, Vietnam, Korea, and the 1960s. All of those decades have come in between our grandparents and us. So not just changes like this, but changes in the way we think and in how we talk, too. Now, the historians like to name the decades. Some of them I just named for you. But they've come up for another name for another decade now. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's the 1990s. The 1990s have been dubbed the last great decade. Isn't that terrible? There are no more great decades. The last one was 1990. There's no more to come. And I don't believe that any more than you do. There are some great things that God has in mind yet, for us and for the world. But they like to, historians like to kind of peg things that way. The other thing they have pegged is that this is now, since 1990s, we are in the post-Christian era. Do you understand that? Christianity is passé. I don't think that will be true 2,000 years from now, and I don't think it's true now, but that's when we've been pegged. It's the post-Christian era where morality is a relative term. Morality is a relative term. Where principles are absolute. Where purpose is without any question, with questionable. Where a culture that no longer supports Christianity. Where the last great decade was the 1990s. Pretty serious, isn't it? So what does the post-Christian era look like? You know, I don't have a lot of facts. They don't tell us when they tell us this, what that means. But I have one illustration for you, what I think it means, and it gives us some clue if this is the truth of anything. I want to tell you the story of the fortune tellers. It happened last Christmas season at a holiday party given by one of Orange County's largest technology firms at one of Newport Beach's most wonderful hotel. And there were lots of people there, yet mostly in their 20s and 30s, a very handsome group of people. And they were enjoying dancing and drinking and a casino that had been set up and lots of wonderful buffets all over. But there was one quiet room off to the side where there were 5 or 6 fortune tellers. Now, they were entertainers. They were not fortune tellers who had set up a shop down in Laguna Beach in one of the buildings that you see sometimes. These were entertainers to entertain the crowd. And it was a quiet room because they had to speak quietly, one-on-one to people. Different circumstance that people are not real familiar with, to have a serious conversation one by one with us. But that's what was going on, and there were long lines. And I had the opportunity to hear some of the things that those fortune tellers were hearing. If you're familiar with palm reading, I'll give you a quick lesson. There are two lines that they were very interested in. It's this top line here, which shows your relationships. This is all in theory, of course. This is your relationships. And then the big line that comes down is your lifeline. Those were the two which drove the most attention, because they are unable to sustain lasting, loving, supportive relationships. Where do I find someone who will be with me next week, not alone tomorrow? Relationships are in a state of despair. It's despair. To have a long-term friendship. How many of you have friends from your childhood? I do. Of course you do. We tend, in this church, we have lots of long friendships in this church, lots of long associations. We have an understanding of what it means to sustain personal relationships and caring for one another. But they are in despair over it. It's the number one question that they were asking. How do I find somebody? Not alone sustain it. I can't even find someone who will be with me tomorrow morning. The second thing is the lifeline that they were concerned about. Here's the lifeline. It goes down here, and there's sometimes places that mark across it. They get concerned about that, and you say, well, you see it get past that. It goes on. And then they point, hold up your hand, and they go around this way, and they say, but it ends. The lifeline ends. It can't get past it. There's an ending to it. And the fortune teller would say, well, yes, there is death. And they don't like death. They can't explain it. They can't cope with it. And they are, if you go deep enough into this post-Christian era, you will find despair over relationships and fear over the future. So that's the post-Christian era. Let's go back to the Christian era, please. There's no future into that. So how can we live with some kind of purpose and meaning and immortality? I'd like to stand outside the doors here and say, come in, would you please come in? We can answer what you're feeling and what you're crying for. We have the answers here. Come inside. And this is where life is abundant. And there's life everlasting. And there's life that's like a cool drink of water. In both scriptures, from the Old Testament and the New, we have Jesus himself comparing himself to a cool drink of water. And we have in the past in the Psalms a cool drink of water offered in the desert. This is where there is that cool drink of water that we so despair for. So how is it that we live then? How can we live in these circumstances? Come, tell me how you live. I want to show you what is one of my favorite pictures of Jesus. We have it hanging in the Wesley room over here. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's the laughing Christ. Isn't that a good picture of Jesus? He's smiling and laughing. I hope you see it in there. And when you see it, you understand that when I ask the question, come tell me how you live, the very first response is joy, happiness, laughter. Over all the other things I'm going to say about purpose and principles and everything else, which are important, it is joy, which is at the center of our faith. So joyful that we even have a picture of the laughing Christ. So we're going to start out with some fun. I know we don't usually start a sermon very easily with fun, but I have a poem here that I want to read to you. It's unexpectedly from Agatha Christie. You know who Agatha Christie is? She wrote murder mysteries. Agatha Christie wrote this poem. It's called Come Tell Me How You Live. I know I borrowed it, didn't I? But you can borrow titles. They're not copyrighted. So as long as I give attribution to Agatha Christie, I can use it as a title. So the sermon has the title, and this poem by Agatha Christie has the title, Come Tell Me How You Live. I'm only going to read a couple of verses. It's a little long, but it is fun. And it's Agatha Christie writing about her marriage. She was married to an archaeologist who specialized in the Middle East. He was knighted by the Queen. He was a very famous archaeologist. And wherever he went to dig, he built a little structure for her with a table and a typewriter, so she could write her books while he was out digging. And he would dig on a tell. If you know something about archaeology, you know a tell is a mound of debris that has been dug up from the earth, and you can go through it and find pieces of the past civilizations. So the word tell is used in this poem. I also think it's interesting that this poem, I think, is very funny. And I think also that a sense of humor and sense of fun is essential to a marriage. I think God invented marriage so he could laugh, actually. Imagine putting two people together. One likes it hot and the other likes it cold. One stays up late and the other goes to bed early. Everything that you can think of opposite, God puts you together and says, now be married and have a happy life. I'm some expert on that because Don and I were married 55 years yesterday and had an anniversary. Actually, he's the one that should be applauded. Anyhow, this is Agatha Christie writing about marriage, and I think it's fun, and it's called Come Tell Me How You Live. I'll tell you everything I can if you will listen well. I met an erudite young man sitting on a tell. Who are you, sir? To him I said, for what is it you look? His answer trickled through my head like bloodstains in a book. He said, I look for ancient pots of prehistoric days, and then I measure them in lots and lots of different ways, and then, like you, I start to write. My words are twice as long as yours, and far more erudite. They prove my colleagues wrong. But I was thinking of a plan to kill a millionaire and hide the body in a van or some large Frigidaire. So having no reply to give and feeling rather shy, I cried, come tell me how you live, and when and where and why. His accents mild were full of wit. 5,000 years ago is really, when I think of it, the choicest ages I know. And once you learn to scorn AD, and you've got the knack, then you could come and dig with me and never wander back. But I was thinking how to thrust some arsenic into tea, and could not all at once adjust my mind so far BC. I looked at him and softly sighed. His face was pleasant too. Come, tell me how you live, I cried, and what is it you do? Well, that's just a bit of fun to show that a sense of humor is essential to living the Christian faith. But now, while I believe that this kind of joy and happiness always surrounds us no matter what we are doing, I'll get down to three serious things with us. First of all, I believe we live with purpose. It's essential to have a purpose. And as we age and as we grow and as we lose certain strengths and have more weaknesses, or the other way around, we still require purpose to our lives. What purpose can we have that suits us every single day of our life, as long as we live? Well, I admit that I am a little proud to be able to say this, because as United Methodist, I believe that a statement by John Wesley gives us just such a purpose. You're all familiar with the few lines that he wrote. It's so central to knowing something of Methodism, and John Wesley especially. But listen to this and see if this isn't purpose for you. A purpose for each one of us as long as we live. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, and all the ways you can, and all the places you can, and all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. Do all the good you can. So the central question begins and ends each time we have a decision to make, each time we are moving through life. What is the good that this is doing? And Wesley suggested that we can do good with all the means, and all the ways, and all the places, as all the times, to all the people, just as long as we ever can. Most of you know my brother was a Methodist pastor, and after his retirement, he grew a great many physical ailments and concerns. But he kept thinking, what is it that I can do? Still do. What can I still do? And he finally decided that even though he could hardly get around, he used a scooter and went all over Pasadena on buses everywhere, on strange cafes, strange places. And he believed he had a new ministry of affirmation, of affirming people. Whomever he sat next to, whoever he could make contact with, he affirmed them by what he said, by being interested in them, by loving them. And that was his ministry of affirmation, even when his body was failing him. So we always have the opportunity to live with purpose. I want to emphasize that a little bit with another poem. I'd like you to take your hand and hold it in front of you and look at your hand as I read you this wonderful poem by the Japanese poet Kagawa. I cannot invent new things like the airships which sail on silver wings. But today a wonderful thought in the dawn was given. The stripes on my robe shining from where were suddenly fair, bright with a light falling from heaven, gold and silver and bronze, lights from the windows of heaven. And the thought was this, that a secret plan is hid in my hand, big because of this plan, that God, who dwells in my hand, knows this secret plan of the things he will do for the world using my hand. Well, in addition to purpose, I believe we must live with principles. That's one thing that the post-Christian era is without, principles. All principles are suspect in this world of post-Christianity, which I don't believe for a moment, but which is being said. So I've listed just a few principles that I've come across in my lifetime that you might like to consider, and maybe you already have. But there are just a couple of them here. The first principle that I believe in is that the central journey of our life is a spiritual journey. We are making physical ones, that's for sure. You look in the mirror, you can see that. We're making mental ones. I can't tell you how many times I forget something each day if I'm not paying attention, and even if I'm paying attention. But we're making physical or mental journeys, that's for sure. But the central journey, the real journey of our life, is a spiritual journey. Therefore, feed your spirits. You're here this morning. Say prayers, listen to fine music, look at fine art, look at a flower. Feed your spirit every day with something. That's your real journey. That's the journey we are making, and that we can make joyfully with joy. I believe that the second principle, that the final judgment of our life, if there is a judgment made, it will be how much and how well we brought unconditional love to the world, to people, to animals, and to plants. How much do you bring unconditional love? How much have you brought unconditional love? How many times have you given love without any conditions? You don't have to dress this way. You don't have to eat this food. You don't have to do anything to have my love. It's unconditional for animals, plants, people. I believe that thoughts of distress in the middle of the night aren't valid. I believe you always have to wait till morning before you get too distressed. I'm very good at worrying in the middle of the night, but the fact is, the stress in the middle of the night is seldom valid distress. Always wait for the dawning, and then look at it again. I believe that upholding moral and ethical standards of behavior is among our deepest longings and our sacred duty. And it is the work of our hands to uphold moral and ethical standards. I went to Occidental College at a time when they had the honor system. And when I get together with my graduates from my year, a reunion, there are two things they talk about as the best things about college. One was a class called Civilization, and it was 6 units for 4 semesters, so you had a lot of history of civilization classes. But it really grounded us in history. The other thing is the honor system. You could leave your purse in the middle of the campus and come back an hour later and no one would have touched it. When you took an exam, there was no professor in the room. You were on your honor not to cheat. And because they trusted us so much,